Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Utter Bollocks with me, Otto English.
And me, John Mitchinson. Now, most podcasts I know would offer you a menu of the day, but we, on Utter Bollocks, are fully a la carte. We have questions aplenty for Otto and I to ponder. Shall we get on with it, Otto?
Yes, please, John. It's a chop for me this week.
Well, I'm going for the fish course this week.
This week's episode is about dolphins and guillotines. Otto's question for John this week concerns our cetacean friends and their apparent intelligence. Are dolphins really smarter than humans?
It's a good question, Otto. It's a good question, but I would say it's the wrong question. And let me explain why. People will often say, in fact, I think you were mentioning earlier, there's a famous Peter Cook sketch, which is about dolphins never having invented the wheel. So there are clearly differences in intelligence between dolphins and human beings. One of the reasons this question so often gets asked is, well, there are two reasons. One is that dolphins do have larger brains than human beings, and the other is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where basically Douglas Adams created a sense of dolphins being a superior intelligence, and when the planet was finally destroyed, the dolphins had all managed to get off the planet. Hence the famous phrase, and I think one of the titles of one of his last books, maybe, "So long and thanks for all the fish." Dolphins and whales do have larger brains than human beings. And they do seem to have, despite having been completely set on separate evolutionary paths for about 50 million years, they do seem to have evolved brains that can handle the things that primate brains can handle, notably deep and complex social interactions.
But sorry to interrupt. How do we know that?
How do we know that they can do that?
Yes.
We can do that by observing their behaviour. That's the easy bit. So we do know that they communicate in clicks, and that these clicks have huge variety of complexity. I mean, the clicks are also used for echolocation. Quite often, they're swimming through darkness, and sound carries 4 times more effectively in water. So there's a lot of work that's been done into how dolphins communicate. Whether we can call their series of clicks a language exactly is a moot point. Whales have even more complex linguistic interactions. What they seem to be able to do, this is one of the problems, this is one of the struggles that we have. When we talk about brains and intelligence, what we now really understand about brains and intelligence is that that's hugely to do with our interaction with the environment. So there used to be this idea that different creatures have very different brains. It now looks like the basic pattern of the mammalian brain is the same, and they have evolved over a long period of time. But the neurons in the brain of a primate, or indeed in the brain of a rat, are very similar to and behave in a very similar way to the neurons in a human brain. But our brains clearly have evolved in different directions and with different adaptations to those of dolphins and whales. So the problem is, what do you need your intelligence for? It's to survive within your environment, okay? To find mates, to pass on your genes. Those are the basic reasons that a brain, assuming obviously also that you accept evolution as a theory, broadly.
I think we've known each other long enough, John, to discover that at this point in our relationship, I am not a denier of evolution.
So, for me, the interesting thing is that why do whales and dolphins, other than the fact that they have quite large bodies, larger bodies than ours, why have they needed intelligence? We may never know the full reason for that, but they have evolved, as I say. We know that they have dialects. We know that...
Really? Yeah. Wait, hold on. We know they have dialects?
Yeah, we know that dolphins and whales there are regional patterns to the sounds that they make. Defining intelligence, not easy to do, but, the ability to solve problems. We know that dolphins are smart. They recognise themselves in mirrors. They use tools. They can put a bit of sponge on their nose when they're frolicking around in coral. We know that they can interact with humans, that they can shoal fish into nets for humans in return for getting some cheap and easy bits of fish thrown back to them. We know, obviously, they use sonar to track and hunt. And what we don't really know is the inner life of the dolphin or the whale.
The private life.
Yeah, you hear this.
What do they do once the waves have withdrawn?
Well, we look at whale song. There's some evidence that whale song does have sort of syntactic structure, that they're doing extraordinary, complex things. We just don't know whether it's kind of, whale Tinder. Could be. We don't know whether it's whale sat-nav, I'm over here. We don't know whether it's epic poetry or sagas, we don't know whether we will never probably know. What's interesting, though, what I would say to you is large, complex brains, they live in the dark, so sound is massively important to them. And we're always trying to, even when we're at our best, we always anthropomorphize. So we say, there are syntactic patterns in whale song. But what if human beings, right? Our brains have been more visually driven because of where we live. And also we think that the evolution of language probably started with our hands, because our hands, our opposable thumbs and the clever things that we're able to do with our fingers, pretty important adaptation. Not so good if you've got fins, right? So if you've got a very big brain and you've got complex social interactions and you've got family pods and possibly all kinds of things that make you feel part of a community, which, language and complexity of social behaviour seem to go together, complex systems. Imagine what it's like if you are a whale and you're able to make sounds that are not just... Our language is all about sounds strung together in linear patterns. That's what language is. It's sounds, phonemes, strung together to make sense. They are able, potentially, we don't know this because we've never been inside the brain, but they have this amazing sonar capacity to listen to similar harmonics and sounds and frequencies at a completely different level to us. We don't have the equipment in our brains to be able to hear or to interpret or to listen in the same way that a whale or a dolphin does. So I guess coming back to intelligence, there's an amazing film on Netflix called My Octopus Teacher, right? So octopuses, astonishingly, if you're going to invent an alien, the thing that's furthest away from us that has intelligence on the planet, you'd probably come up with something that looked a bit like an octopus. We don't share that much evolutionary history with octopuses. They have brains in each of their legs. They have a sort of distributed brain. They have, whatever it is, 7 hearts and blue blood, and they're weird, right? Just weird. And yet, over the course of that year, Craig Foster, the guy who made the film, forms a genuine relationship with a female octopus. And the female octopus seems to not only recognise him, seems to do all kinds of things. There's a particular amazing bit where the octopus just seems to be playing. It seems to be doing something just for the hell of it, for the fun of it. So that's quite a high level.
Yeah.
And we know that octopuses can solve simple problems. They can unscrew jars and all that kind of thing. So intelligence is about being able to... Fundamentally, it's about being able to survive as a species and to adapt to an environment. But the more we look into animal intelligence, the more we seem to discover that there's kinds of intelligence that we haven't even suspected. So that's why I say, are dolphins more intelligent than us? In certain ways, they may well be, but they're in certain ways that we don't understand because our brains are not equipped to understand it. So I don't know where that leaves us.
Well, I have an additional question because you've just reminded me of something. One of my pet hates, which actually therefore is one of my pet joys because I like being triggered by things. Unless you hadn't noticed.
Trigger warning for all
trigger
of those
warning
people
for
who
everyone.
are triggered by people being triggered.
Are sort of crappy Facebook memes. In fact, sometimes I think the only reason I linger on Facebook is for, news of relatives and also for crappy Facebook memes. And just yesterday, I saw one which claimed that when a whale gives birth, dolphins crowd around the whale to protect the whale from sharks. And I thought, A, is that true? Because it sounds a bit bullshitty. And B, what would be in it for the dolphins if that was true?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I do know, not altogether the same story, but we do know that there have been increasing reports from the Mediterranean and the Atlantic of killer whales ramming human boats for no good reason. We don't really understand why they're doing it. But one of the things that people say is they just seem to be really cross and annoyed. I mean, the problem
is
with
it
this...
Brexit?
Could easily be, yeah. The thing orcas against Brexit.
News has finally reached the
idea of
orcas.
feeding farage to a really pissed off kind of pro-European killer whale is very... No,
their freedom of movement has been limited.
Killer whales, of course, are not with killer whales; they're dolphins. So, I'm not sure. I mean, there is lots of evidence of interspecies kind of not exactly communication, but of help. There must be some evolutionary benefit to the dolphin. I mean, pure altruism it's an interesting point about altruism and human beings. Are we the only altruistic? I mean, are we ever actually altruistic? Is the argument. Where it becomes, I think, complicated is, I'm a little skeptical of the whole swimming with dolphins nature cure. I mean, I think it's amazing to go and look at nature, but I think most of the human dolphin interactions, if you look at the statistics, have had a deleterious effect on the animals, whatever the effect on the humans. And that mostly what we really should do is allow animals to live their own lives. I mean, the dolphins, for all their intelligence and their big smiley faces, gang rape is quite a common occurrence among dolphins. They batter porpoises to death on a regular basis. And if there is, kind of often, as various people who've been intimate with dolphins, swimming with them will know, quite often they do they mistake boys for other dolphins, or even humans for other dolphins. And a male dolphin can be 40 stone. That's a big beast, and it has a remarkable penis. The dolphin that has a slightly prehensile hook at the end, right, which is somebody said they could catch an eel with it, or anything else. You just don't want to. Again, animals and sex and weirdness and strangeness and difference. My view always on these things is that we don't know. We don't know.
Just leave
fully.
them.
Leave them alone. Let them get on with their own.
Let them get on.
lives.
Let them do their thing. It's like cats in a house. Just leave it alone. It'll be happy.
Yes. You know what they say? If cats could talk, they wouldn't.
To remind you mere mortals, the question is, are dolphins more intelligent than humans? Let me fire up my octopus neural network and see exactly what the mass-digitized wisdom of the world concludes. Dolphins have a brain-to-body ratio second only to humans, suggesting high intelligence. They can solve complex problems and use tools, like sponges, to protect their snouts. They have complex communication skills and may even use echolocation to create mental pictures for each other and pass the mirror test, a sign of self-recognition seen in few animals. However, humans use a much wider range of complex tools and can invent new ones. They can reason about things beyond their immediate surroundings, and human language allows for complex communication and the transmission of knowledge across generations. So, while dolphins are incredibly smart, humans seem to have an edge.
So that's interesting to me. And I'm listening to you speak and listening to AI Joe's answer there, I start to think, it's human perspective. Well, in that case, AI is still human perspective. It's human perspective, isn't it? We are walking around judging. It's very biblical, isn't it? It's very Genesis. It's like we are the guardians and we're in charge, and therefore everyone has to fall in line. And yet Their intelligence is different to
exactly.
us.
Of our kind of knowledge, we are the masters.
Yeah.
Of our way of knowing, we are clearly superior to.
Absolutely.
And I think you could argue that those species that we're most similar to, chimps and bonobos, we have more complex tools, more complex skills, but I think the other thing is that that's the point I was sort of trying to make, that adaptation, we're unique in one way in that we have adapted to the extent that we've now leapfrogged evolution. We're not, I think I read somewhere where that if the human population was the same proportion as the rest of primate species, there'd only be about 1 million humans on the planet. And we have used technology. We've used the kind of combination of our brains and our hands to transform our evolutionary prospects so on that level. But in terms of just pure intelligence, I think living in a dark ocean, surrounded where you have to navigate through sound and communicate through sound, your brains are probably going to evolve in all sorts of different directions with different skills and different ways of thinking and being intelligent that we would find difficult and do find difficult, which is why we anthropomorphize everything. When we look at apes, we see primitive versions of human behavior. In fact, we now know that really what we are apes that didn't grow up, in the way that, we've made domesticated dogs, which are wolves that haven't grown up. Neoteny, as it's called. But that's another. That's
an argument for another day.
Yeah.
I don't think it's bollocks at all. I think it's like comparing apples and chairs rather than pears.
It feels like a category error. That in terms of human intelligence, it's obviously utter bollocks. But hey, if you haven't noticed, the 40-stone guys with the prehensile penis over there isn't a human. It's a dolphin.
It's just someone you haven't met yet.
And the conclusion is piffle. John's question for Otto this week is a real head-scratcher. Was Joseph Ignace Guillotin, the inventor of the guillotine, executed by his own invention?
The guillotine. Did its inventor, Joseph Ignace Guillotin, die by the use of his own machine?
It's a great story and one I love. In fact, I'm currently slightly obsessed with state execution. As you do, partly because I'm writing, my current project involves a lot of people being killed because it's about sort of history's baddies.
Killed efficiently
and inefficiently. In fact, I just wrote something for Byline Times, an edition of which will have come out a few months ago, which was about the Tower of London and being hanged and drawn and quartered, which of course is not very efficient. Very unpleasant and an inefficient way to kill people, but a way of demonstrating your power and instilling the fear of God into everybody.
Because this wasn't the skill to keep them alive through the whole process.
Correct.
Your entrails were drawn and set fire to.
And who was the first famous victim of this style of punishment, do you know?
I don't know.
It was David ab Grufford, the last real Prince of Wales, who Edward Longshanks put to death using that methodology. And do you know also when it was last employed as a public spectacle?
Probably much more recently than we think.
Yeah, I mean, not quite as recently, but certainly I think it was around 1765.
18th century.
18th century.
The Age of Reason.
The Age of Reason, just before the French Revolution, a Scottish clerk in Portsmouth who had made the mistake of writing letters to the French was found guilty of high treason and was publicly executed using that method. And it was the last time it was used, which is absolutely shocking, which leads me neatly on to the Reign of Terror, because in our popular imagination, we think of the bloodthirsty French across the English Channel chopping off the aristocrats' heads just 20 years after. And in fact, that was not the last time somebody was hanged, drawn and quartered. That was the last time somebody was publicly hanged, drawn and quartered. They used it for about, well into the very early 19th century.
Really, Mike?
Which is really shocking, really shocking. The guillotine, let's use the English name, let's not butcher the French language as hanging and drawing and quartering. the guillotine, as we call it, is a fascinating one because actually, of course, it was introduced as a more humane method of execution. As we know, beheading people was viewed as the sort of right of the aristocracy, which is why in this country, kings and queens, Anne Boleyn, etc., were beheaded, and very often by expert executioners who were brought over from France to do it, because this was considered the most humane way to kill someone, much more humane than hanging somebody or drawing and quartering them. Incidentally, do you know how many people were executed at the Tower of London during its long, inglorious, violent history? I'll let you guess within 50.
I don't know, a couple of hundred?
22.
Ah, very good.
And half of those were executed during the 20th century. So just 11 people between it being built by William the Conqueror and the dawn of the 20th century.
Is it true that the last people to be held there as prisoners were Ronnie and Reggie Cray?
There is a story about Ronnie and Reggie Cray being there, I think, for assaulting a police officer.
Yeah,
I have a feeling that a soldier. I think they did their national service there, bizarrely. Anyway, that's something for another day, a myth for another day. So the guillotine was introduced in France by Joseph Ignace Guillotin, basically suggesting that this method of execution be used because it was more humane, and he campaigned for it. And the reason he campaigned for it was he was actually against the death penalty. Fun fact. Another fun fact, and it's not a very fun topic, but another fun fact is he did not invent the instrument of death which bore his name. In fact, guess who did? The English, because
Halifax gibbet.
The Halifax gibbet, which has a history stretching back to the 13th century. And if you look up images of the Halifax gibbet, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same thing. So people were using mechanical methods of and the Halifax gibbet had a history of about 300 years and only stopped being used when Oliver Cromwell came along and stopped everybody's fun. And so you can't go around using that. It's inhumane.
So, guillotine design, but
So he didn't invent it. It was actually invented and perfected by a man called Antoine Louis, who perfected the modern method of guillotine.
With the diagonal blade.
With the diagonal blade.
Yeah.
Efficiently and sharply cutting people's heads off. And I'm going to say, poor old Guillotin got his name attached to it because he had campaigned for its use. Subsequently, everybody called it the guillotine or the guillotine.
Although wasn't it not briefly called the Louis set or something? I'm sure I read that. After Louis himself, but it didn't catch on.
Didn't catch on.
Guillotine seems like a much better word.
Sounds right, doesn't it? Weirdly, it seems really appropriate, but maybe it's just because we've grown up with it. Talking of growing up with it, do you know when the last person to be guillotined in France was guillotined?
I do know that it was something like 1977.
Oh, you're good, John. It was September 1977. In fact, it was September the 10th, 1977, which is, fun fact, 1 week after Star Wars was premiered in France. So a week after, it's a fun, crazy fact that a week after Star Wars premiered at a festival in France, the last person in France was beheaded privately by the guillotine. The last public execution using the guillotine was in 1939, when a German serial killer was guillotined there, and a 17-year-old English exchange student called Christopher Lee later claimed that he had witnessed the event. However, Christopher Lee, on examination, is one of those people who told some quite interesting tall tales, and that does always make me slightly suspicious of anyone. Anyway, let's get on to the actual topic. I think we rather went round the house there. After Guillotine died, his family got incredibly angry and upset that his name was attached to the instrument, because as they kept pointing out, he was a peace-loving guy who didn't believe in state execution. And I'm afraid the bit about him being guillotined isn't true.
No.
In fact, we can blame the English for that one, because in 1818, an update of Johnson's dictionary, the definition, along with a lot of the crazy definitions of Johnson's dictionary, of which I'm sure you will have further examples, claimed that he was executed by his own invention. It's not true.
It was just a bit of shade cast at the French.
Well, it's
why not?
in an era before fact-checking, as we've talked about many times in this podcast before, people just made shit up and thought, oh, that'll do. Maybe after a big lunch.
Well, it's always tempting, it's also always tempting in a book just to stick one thing in there to see if anybody notices.
It's also really tempting sometimes. I've just had this with something I'm writing, to kind of err on the side of the good story. And I make a living out of fact-checking stuff with, but sometimes it's such a good story. You want the good story.
Almost always. There ought to be a word for that.
It's very annoying.
In the way that, acronyms are always, the derivation of acronyms is always wrong because they were pretty much never used until the Second World War. But people love them. They love, to ensure promptness for tip and port out, starboard home, and fascinating. But what I do know about the guillotine, other than that, is it was the Nazis who really went for it. They used, I think there were tens of thousands of people executed in Nazi Germany by it, presumably because it was still considered to be a quick and efficient way of dispatching people until you found a quicker and more supposedly humane way of killing people.
Yeah, and it's mechanised, of course, isn't it? So, that's the thing with executing people. It's about releasing the execution of themselves from a degree of the responsibility involved, thus sort of, whereas in England, famously, you had hereditary hangmen, basically, who went around hanging people. But the mechanisation removes that human element of responsibility, and that's why I think things like the guillotine remained being used and remained popular, whereas hanging and firing squads and things fell out of fashion.
Yeah, there's all that kind of mythology about Pierpont, wasn't there? He could estimate the length of the drop by shaking someone's hand and all that sort of stuff.
And all his stories about he was a real gentleman.
Lovely man.
Went to execution with a lovely, lovely demeanour.
But do you think it's part of this? There's an obvious irony, isn't there? Hoist by your own petard, isn't it? That we love these ideas that inventions turn on their inventors.
Yes.
We talked in a previous episode about the famous Thomas
Midgley, yes.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately is a myth.
Yeah, sadly. Again, I think it's not impossible that occasionally does happen. You could argue that Marie Curie paid the ultimate price from her playing around with radium. Yes,
and Midgley actually played around with lead.
Yeah.
And continually was poisoning himself. If people remember, that episode is about 3,000 years ago. But
the man who put lead in petrol and
the man who put lead
in
fridges. He did constantly poison himself to the point of near death, trying to prove that lead was safe.
Yeah.
So there was a kind of hoisted by his own petard thing, but he wasn't killed by his own invention.
In the case, it seems to me that in the case of the guillotine or the guillotine. Not only did he not invent it, really, he definitely didn't die at his own hands. So this is an absolutely prime, succulent kind of piece of utter bollocks.
It's prime utter bollocks.
One of the most, open
Grenadian.
and shut.
Yeah.
We're slicing through the myth with a kind of an efficient and humane action on this one.
Non, Josephinas Guillotin was not executed by his own invention. Guillotin did not invent the beheading machine, although it became associated with his name during the French Revolution. He actually advocated for a more humane execution method than the barbaric ones used at the time. Guillotin died a natural death in 1814, not by the guillotine.
So AI Joe is absolutely on the money there for a change, I have to add.
Yeah, she's hit the nail on the head, as it were, or the victim on the neck.
The blade has struck.
Yes.
Yes.
We're all in agreement. Utter bollocks.
And the conclusion is utter bollocks. And now we come to our audience-friendly Any Answers sections.
So we have a question from a member of the team, not a member of the public, from Ed, who wonders how long the human head remains sentient after it is detached from its body by the guillotine.
Well, the answer is we don't. We don't know.
No one's ever come back.
I mean, there are anecdotal stories. Charlotte Corday, who was executed for having assassinated Marat in his bath, supposedly blinked, or she had a flushed, she looked embarrassed when they held her head up to show that she was. There are occasional stories of people.
I don't believe it.
I would say that the trauma. Honestly, I mean, this is part of the problem. This gets us into a whole other and quite exciting area, which is the brain in the jar. Is it possible for the brain to survive outside the body? And the answer is no. It is not. They are one system. Is it possible for somebody to live without a leg? Yes, we know that, or an arm. But the brain and the brainstem and the spinal column, they're so fundamental to our existence as an organism. We know that, unlike cockroaches, who can live for some period of time after their head has been removed, and what's even more creepy, their heads also can survive without their body for a certain period of time.
Much like the Conservative Party.
Brilliant. I mean, the thing is, I would imagine, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but from what I've read on this, we can't absolutely prove it. And if there are twitches and blinks, the idea that they would be being consciously kind of processed by the brain, I think is probably unlikely. That the brain, the massive loss of blood would lead to loss of consciousness. We know trauma often leads to loss of consciousness. So I would be, the idea that there's a head blinking around the basket thinking, hell, where's my body gone? Our brains are embodied. What becomes interesting is whether we can, and this does interest me, is if we start to use tools like paper and notebooks and smartphones, and they become essentially part of the way that we interact with the world. Are they part of the same system? Have we embodied things that are beyond our body? Can tools become part of our embodied system? We can obviously live without our smartphones.
Wow.
But philosophically, it's an interesting idea.
That's quite enough from us for another week. So it's goodbye from me, Otto English.
And it's goodbye from me, John Mitchinson.
This has been a Byline audio production in association with Unbound, produced and edited by Marcus de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, and for even more bollocks with Peter Jukes, do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.